So not to buy the famous Ted Cruz crystal ball, you may remember that he predicted not just a red wave, but a red tsunami, and we are still waiting for it. So if we look at the midterms result, everybody can find reason to rejoice or to lament. But in this game, it seemed that the Republicans lost the most, maybe due to their expectation. Maybe Donald Trump was a clear loser because he promoted and defended candidates who cost maybe the Senate to the Republican Party. So in the same time, he still has a grip maybe on a very strategic electorate, the one who votes for the Republican primaries. On the other hand, we have Joe Biden, often underestimated, who appears more than a survivor. He is a good position now to maybe project himself in the future, but he turned 80. He looks already 82, maybe 83. So if he would run again, we would more than ever enter uncharted territories. So we will try to divide our panel in three parts. The first part will be devoted to the results, go deeper in the results. And the second part will be for the perspectives, what lesson we can draw for it. And the last part will be for you, for your question. May I suggest in advance to respect the rules, the well-known rules. You're supposed to present yourself, and you're supposed to ask real question with a question mark at the end. So let's start with the first part, and maybe with John. John is a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute. He is a pillar of the Election Watch program for many years. And I think he can really give us the clearest picture of the results and the new balance of power at the Congress level, but also at the states level.
Thank you very much, Gilles, and thank you to Ifri for having me here. Thank you for all of you for coming. I think we're all happy to be in person after many years of being on Zoom. It is a pleasure to have personal contact. And I do want to make one apology because I know we have in the spirit of transatlanticism, we have a French and English panels, and I have this very French name, but I am speaking in English because my French is not very good, but my ancestor did leave Dieppe in 1663. So I will excuse myself for having a long time since my people have been here. Gilles is right that this election was generally a good one for the Democrats and not so good for Republicans. And I think that has really to go back to the expectations because in an aggregate sense, Republicans did make some gains and we can talk about that. But what we would expect in an election like this, what I mean by that is a midterm election, an election between the two presidential elections, where the president of the party in the midterm his party does not do well in elections. So it's a long history we have going back to our Civil War in the 1860s. Only 3 times in all of those midterm elections has the party in power in the White House gained seats in the House of Representatives. Usually they lose seats. And secondly, when a president has a lower job approval rating, and Joe Biden does have a low job approval rating by any standard in the low 40% range, 40, 42, 43, depending on what you look at for polls. Those 2 factors alone should lead us to say Republicans would make significant gains, especially in the House, but probably in the Senate and across the country. And what happened was a small gain in the Republicans in the House, smaller than expected, and some losses in some other places, which we can lay out. What would have I expected before the election? Well, again, I think it perhaps looked even worse for Joe Biden and Democrats in the late spring when, for us, the gasoline prices were the highest. Inflation seemed to be really going up even more. And there was some talk even that Joe Biden might be challenged by his own party or be left. Things are a little bit better than they were then, but still his numbers aren't very good. What we would have expected would be maybe a 20-seat gain for Republicans in the House, some seats in the Senate. And what we saw was a 9-seat gain for Republicans. A real gain. They've taken the majority. That is a real difference in American politics. We will not have the presidency, the Senate, and the House all in the same party's hands. We will have divided government, which is very common for us. And it doesn't mean nothing will get done, but it does mean that we will not be working off the Democratic Joe Biden agenda for what we pass in laws. They've had very narrow majorities, but they've been pretty successful with those small majorities in passing some things. That will not happen. The Senate, again, the Senate was tied at 50-50. There seemed like a very good number of possibilities for Republicans to pick up at least one seat and take the majority. It turns out now with the Georgia result finalized, they've lost one seat. It will now be 51 for Democrats and 49 for Republicans. Still very close, but again, disappointing for Republicans. Governorships also, the Republicans lost one net, and even some of our state legislatures, a few of them moved in the Democratic direction rather than what Republicans might have thought in the Republican direction. So by expectations, it was a disappointing election. But if you look below the surface, I think it's a little more complicated. There was a Republican swing in many ways. It just wasn't as big as we would have expected. If you look at the vote that Joe Biden got in 2020, and the vote that Republicans will get overall in the House, and that's a little bit of a hard number to calculate, but it looks like about a 6-point swing from where Republicans were in 2020 to 2022. If it had been an 8-point swing, I think we would have been talking like a more normal distribution of seats. But so it was a little bit short, but still a real move in the Republican direction. And it was very uneven in various states, more than we expect. And so a couple of places Republicans did very, very well. The state of Florida, and I guess we'll come back to that a little bit if we mention the name of Ron DeSantis, the governor there, who is a possible candidate for Republicans to run in 2024. But also in New York State, a very Democratic-leaning state where Republicans made some big gains. Those two states alone, Republicans made the gains that got them the majority in the House. They gained about 7 seats from where they are today. And they did very well. Other states as well we weren't paying attention to. But Democrats did very, very well in a number of states where the high-profile Senate races were, in Georgia and Arizona and Pennsylvania, as well as some other places in the upper Midwest in Minnesota, Maine, New Hampshire, and I will underline Michigan as a state that they did particularly well. And so why were we wrong? Why did we think the fundamentals might predict a bigger Republican gain? What happened overall? And I think the answer really is multifaceted. But one answer is that the base of the Democratic Party, at least in certain places, was much more motivated than you would expect in a midterm election. And yes, there are things you can point to, like the abortion decision in the Supreme Court. And I think in some states, I mentioned Michigan again, there was actually a ballot question where that probably really did help Democratic turnout and Democratic performance all across the board. There was also the underlying factor of Donald Trump, who is still a very good motivator for Democrats. Democrats like to get out to vote because they see Donald Trump not on the ballot, but sort of lurking in the background, becoming more prominent in some ways. I think that was also helpful. There was also the question of the candidates that Republicans put up for election. Some criticized Trump, and I think rightly so in some cases, where he supported some candidates who were actually weaker, less experienced, maybe too far right. And ultimately, I think another factor we should point to is we spent a lot of money in this election, not as much as the presidential, but the midterm election is usually much lower. The presidential election you spend for that race that's national at a very high level, but by far the highest in any midterm election, much, much more than 2018. And in key places, again, like Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, we saw spending which was at a very high level. I think the implication is that when you really spend that intense amount of money in advertising, the swings of the midterm might not be as strong. You might have people coming out just at the regular party rates because of the intensity of turnout, intensity of the campaign and the advertising. So the last thing I'll say, we won't talk about the future until the next part, but in terms of what's been happening in American politics that I think people can point to say, well, why did this election maybe not go as much in the Republican direction, is we still have some questions of how the demography of the two parties are changing. And a simple way of putting it is a few years back, really before the Obama years, there was the thesis, which I think has some strength to it, but it's not 100% right, but had this thesis that Democrats have a good future in that the groups that are growing in America are moving in the Democratic direction. And that was, at least at the time, the Hispanic and Asian new immigrant groups, they're growing as part of the electorate. The Democratic Party was also gaining seats or gaining support among college-educated white voters and younger voters, also Democrats. And for Republicans, over time, they've become more the party of the working class white voters, which is still a very big and probably arguably the most important of all of those groups in terms of size, but shrinking, also older voters. And so the thought was, well, Democrats it will always look good for them as we go forward. Donald Trump proved a bit that you can bring up the turnout in certain areas, especially in our Midwest, and win elections that way. But I think there's still a real question as to how well that new Trump coalition, and it's not brand new, it's more of a extension of what trends had happened before, but how much that can continue. There's been a slow march, again, of the more college-educated voters to the Democratic Party. Those voters tend to vote more in midterm elections, where Republicans used to have kind of a structural advantage in midterms where their voters, the college-educated voters, were more likely to turn out. Those voters are more split. In fact, they're even slightly more on the Democratic side. And so I think that sort of advantage, which we took for granted in the past, is now not as true. And the last thing I'll say, again, this is a little bit more about the future, is there still are some interesting questions about what happens with Hispanic voters and Asian voters who at the time of that thesis looked like they were growing and they're certainly a Democratic group. But Republicans have been gaining strength in those groups. And we saw a little bit more of a gain in that direction as well. So some would say Republicans can put together a non-college educated blue collar party, which includes some Hispanics and Asians as well. I think we saw a bit of that. So it was a disappointing result for Republicans, falling short of where they wanted to be. But there was still a swing in the Republican direction. And I'll leave the future for the future panel, the future section of the panel.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Danielle Follett is the chair of Democrats Abroad France, if I'm correct, and she also teaches American literature at La Sorbonne. So a good night or a good month, because election day is dead now. We have to wait until December to have the final picture. A good month for the Democrats, but still some problems in two states mentioned by John. Florida, maybe a problem with Latinos voters, you will tell us, and also in New York State, and maybe a problem with the message. So tell us what you think of that.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to Ifri for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. So what happened in these last midterms? Well, we are very satisfied with the results in general. Besides the Senate, so picking up a seat in the Senate, the Democratic Party gained 4 trifectas. That means we control the 3 instances of power in the states. That is the governorship plus the Senate and House in each of the states. We gained 4 of these: Massachusetts, Minnesota, Michigan, and Maryland, though we lost 1 of them. So that means that today we also have won many important lower level races in many of the states. So we are very satisfied with the results in general, with the turnout towards helping us in the, even on smaller levels of, school board and Secretary of State races, etc. We saw that there was no red wave, as we've talked about, and we you know that the red wave, the idea of the red wave might have been a fiction to begin with, because there were a lot of polls that seemed to say that there would be a red wave, but it was never actually certain that those polls were necessarily based on what the intentions of vote were actually going to be. I'll come back to talking about whether or not this was expected in just a moment. So we saw that there was no also midterm effect. The midterm effect is when the party in power tends to lose a large number of seats in the House of Representatives or in the Senate. We lost some seats, but we didn't have a huge midterm effect in this case. So this is the first time since 1934 that the party in power didn't lose any state level legislative chamber in a midterm election, which is also very significant. And it's also rare that the Democrats in general win a higher percentage of seats in the legislators' chambers than they win the popular vote. This is a rare thing for Democrats. Last time it happened was 2008, which was an unusual election, and then before that was 1994. Now, we can say, as you mentioned, that the big loser in this is is probably Trump and Trump's candidates. So the fact that the issue now is candidate quality among the discourse of the Republicans is something that is going to be, well, we can talk about things going forward in the future, but I'm sure that will be something that we can continue to talk about. But this has, I think, been a very important lesson from these midterms, is that the candidates who were supported by Trump in general tended to lose. His federal level endorsees lost, all except for J.D. Vance in Ohio, the Senate candidate in Ohio. Especially the election deniers, those ones who denied the legitimacy of the 2020 election, tended to lose in this election, which is a great reassurance for our democratic institutions. We're very satisfied with that. For example, the Secretary of State candidate in Arizona, Mark Fincham, had said that if he had been Secretary of State at the time of in 2020, at the time of Joe Biden's election, he would not have approved the election, which would have gone against the democratic will of the people who had elected Biden in the state. So it's a great relief that we have seen that these kinds of candidates were beaten in this election. Now, this is not to say that there are not some election deniers who did win in some of the red states, so who are, very Republican stable states, such as Indiana, South Dakota, Wyoming. We do have election deniers who won the Secretary of State role. And so the Trump effect, that is the Trump influence, is not yet gone. Well, it's certainly there, and this is something that we will talk about going forward. Trump is kind of, though he was not on the ballot literally, many of his candidates were really truly on the ballot. So what we can see is that the fact that we have had smooth elections, that we had very few irregularities, that we have no reason to accuse these elections of fraud, for example. That, remember, there was a lot of fear going into these elections that there might be a war afterwards, or even violence, or people coming to the polls saying that they do not agree with these election results. We did not see this, and this is extremely reassuring for American democracy. So now I don't want to minimize, of course, our win. Of course, we did lose the House. Unfortunately, the Republicans have a slight majority now in the House. The Republicans are divided, and I would like to, it would be interesting to hear, to talk about together about the nature of the Republican composition in the House, because they're going to have a difficult legislating with the difficulty of Kevin McCarthy to be elected as Speaker of the House. We'll see how that goes in the second round of elections on that. But that will be an interesting thing going on. As Joe Biden has said, that we extend our hand to legislating across the aisle in the House, that we want to work together with the Republicans, and that now the ball is in the Republicans' camp also to allow that to happen, so that we can work together and continue to do legislating and not just do obstructionism and not just block things, so that, after 2 years of just blocking things, that we won't be able to have done things. So now to come back to the question of Florida and New York, which are important issues, because, as you know, the House results in Florida and New York were disappointing for Democrats. In both cases, we had strong gerrymandering or redistricting that happened in 2021 that were defavorable to the Democrats. In Florida, it was a very strict one, which was upheld by the Supreme Court of the state of Florida. In New York, it was a redistricting that was actually then overturned and then redone by a rather conservative judge in the state of New York, which tended to be more unfavorable to our side. Now, in the case of Florida, you also have some other factors where a lot of Republicans are actually moving to the state of Florida. And then also there have been massive campaigns. The advertising happening in Florida was very, very strong, massive. You could call it disinformation campaigns about the socialist nature, the communists and the Democrats, et cetera, something that oriented towards the Latino vote in Florida, which there's a lot of Latinos. And so that was, I think, a difficult situation that Democrats faced in the state of Florida. In New York, it's a little bit more complex. In New York, beyond the question of the redistricting, which I mentioned, the issue of abortion was not really on the ballot because abortion rights are protected already on a state level in New York. And so this was less of a motivating factor to bring people out to vote. There was, it had already been established as a right, as a guaranteed right within the state before this election. So as you know, the rights to abortion or reproductive rights were something that motivated so many people to come out to vote in this election in particular, as well as to protect American democratic institutions against the threat of Trumpism. But also in New York, there was also the fact that the Republican candidates did not really fall into the category of the Trumpist candidates. So the democracy was not really an issue. It also was not something that brought out voters, not to motivate voters so much. The issue in New York was mainly crime, and that was something that the Republicans could really kind of take on and try to dominate the discourse on that question. There is a crime issue in New York City, and so that was something that I think could help to explain the results that Democrats saw in the state of New York. I was asked to speak on the question of whether or not these results were expected, and I'll just like to end on that issue. And I'd like to say that actually among our Democratic internal analysts, these results were not unexpected. We had people who were forecasting results such as the ones that we did see. And these were foreseen, for example, in the new voter registrations that we saw already starting in the summer, especially after the overturning of Dobbs. We had early signs of Democratic success with the special election of Mary Peltola in Alaska, first Native American to be elected there. And also there was a Kansas vote on abortion. There was an abortion amendment that was protecting the rights of abortion, which massively won in the state of Kansas. That was over the summer also, which gave us a sense that we have a good wind behind our backs. Also, there were special elections in the state of New York with Pat Ryan winning in a swing district that could have gone the other direction. So we saw that as a good sign. And then massive early vote turnout before the elections, and a really strong level of engagement among young people. So we had young people turned out for Democrats in general. Young people, the millennial generation, are very motivated by issues such as the climate, such as protecting citizens against the proliferation of guns, especially they've seen guns in their high schools, et cetera, and they want to have stronger gun control laws. Very much motivated by the issue of abortion rights, and then also the student debt relief that they benefited from under Biden's recent measures. So no, we actually were expecting some kind of results that were somewhat favorable to us. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Célia will be our last speaker because Corentin Célin was supposed to join us, but unfortunately, he had to take over some colleague in his lycée, if I'm correct. So we will miss him, but Célia is a non-resident fellow with the Center on US and Europe at the Brookings institution, where you spent the 5 years last year.
Yes.
very close to the American Enterprise Institute. Almost think of, you just have to bulldoze the Carnegie Center. Exactly. Nobody will do that. So Célia, please tell us what these results tell us about the ideas, the winning messages for the two parties, main parties.
All right. Thank you, Gilles. And thank you, Laurence, for this invitation. And I'm very happy to be back at Ifri to discuss these issues. I was very interested by John's and Danielle's presentations on what happened. And I do share Danielle's sort of analysis that this was not such an unexpected outcome. Indeed, when looking at polls and in the latest days of the campaign, polls were very unclear because you could see that at the same time you had high unsatisfaction with regard to inflation, worries about the economy, worries about crime-ridden cities, but at the same time you had sort of high energy mobilization on the part of Democratic voters with regard to abortion. You had youth turnout, or at least youth saying they were slightly more engaged, and so it ended up being the case that it was unclear where it would go. And I think the results are as unclear as the polls were, which is, this is effectively a tie. And this is also a continuation of the previous tie. So we are in a moment in American politics where I think, the two parties are tied. At the same time, and I'm coming to the ideas question, at the same time when we are in a moment of high polarization. So you have two parties that are neck to neck, but when it comes down to ideas, you have complete opposite views with almost irreconcilable views on a whole lot of issues. If you take issues such as immigration or climate, the difference between what a Democrat will think or what a Republican will think have increased over time enormously, down to a 40-point difference between the two positions, completely irreconcilable positions between the two sides. So when it comes to voting, it makes the capacity to go from one party to the other highly difficult. And so it comes down to the importance of mobilizing your own camp, because convincing the other side is getting more and more difficult. And we all know that. We also have very high level of negative partisanship. So the impression that the other side is really awful and that if they win, the country will go to the drain. That was well known. But what is increasing is another phenomenon that I think has been demonstrated very, very well by three professors who have written a book called The Bitter End, which demonstrate that there's a form of rigidity in the American political system, what they call the calcification of the system, which makes the system less and less capable of having big shifts and big waves one way or the other. One of the three professor, who is John Sides from the University of North Carolina, says that we live on the knife's edge and small changes tip the balance of power. So the knife's edge represent the two sides that are with a very, very thin edge in the middle. It's the one, from 50 to 50 to 51-49. It's the one seat difference between the two houses. It's very thin. And yet, if, as you said, 9-seat gain in on the Republican side makes a whole difference. Now you have a divided government. So you have a system that has calcified, and they express that not only because of ideas, but also because of the rules of the game that have been played through gerrymandering or voting laws or any other way to done by both parties to try and make the system work better for their side, which in the end results in an extremely high incumbency rate, which means if you are already in a seat, you are 93% likely to be just reelected, just because you are already in the seat, because you are already a Democratic representative in a Democratic district or a Republican in a Republican district. You are so likely to win that you you have to campaign and everything, but basically the system is really, really rigid. And so contrary to other midterms where you saw, dozens of seats flipping from Democrats to Republicans, this time around, there was 1 seat in the Senate and 9 in the Republican Party. So very, very minimal change. So at the same time, you have this calcification. What you have is also that small changes then change everything. And the small change of this year, which was actually a massive change for millions of Americans, is the abortion issue, is the overturning of Roe v. Wade back in June, which may have been the single factor that turned out the few percentage of young people and women that have mobilized around this issue. It turned out to be the second most important issue in exit polls after the economy. The economy is the classic one in a time such as these, but abortion did play an incredibly important role. And so, what does that mean for the future? And I don't want to start the sort of prospective conversation here, but in the end, if we look at this very, very objectively, yes, the Democrats have lost, the capacity to put things in the agenda in the House of Representatives. But apart from that, you still have, a completely tied situation, 51 again, 50-50 or 51-49 is almost the same. You have an extremely small Republican majority. So it doesn't change much. The capacity of Joe Biden, the Democrats, to actually potentially even pass legislation that are bipartisan by nature, convincing the other side that potentially, this is a good thing for either industrializing America or potentially, competing with China. It's almost equivalent. And so arguably, this has not changed very much. And by not changing very much, this is potentially sort of to the advantage of the Democrats because the Republicans needed to regain the ground. But I do believe that in the next 2 years, you don't have such a changed environment that the Democrats and Joe Biden in particular might not be able to have his own policies.
Thank you very much, Célia. We will build on that to open our second round on the prospects. John and Danielle, do you share this view of a chained democracy?
I share a lot of what Célia has said. I think we have a two-party system. I mean, amazingly, we've had essentially the same 2 political parties since the 1860s. There are minor third-party movements every once in a while. I do think it's calcified in a way that depends on what you mean by that. In another way, our parties are somewhat flexible. And so, Donald Trump was not anticipated before 2016, or not put forward by party leaders. And in some ways, because our primary system is so open, anybody can run. You don't need to be the favorite of the party leaders. The people can run and change the set of issues a bit. And so Donald Trump and others over the time have made the parties shift. So while they're closely aligned or similar amounts of power, 50-50, if you want to say that, there's a way in which the parties have changed their positions on things over time. So I think it's calcified in a way, but I think there is a way in which they do respond to voters, and one could make much more dire predictions that, the Republican Party has done poorly and they will disappear. I note, maybe some French parties of note have become a little less powerful or disappeared in various ways over the years. We haven't had that. And so I think I more or less agree. I'm on the question of power, or what the situation is. I do think it's true that change was very small in both houses, but I do think the difference is big in terms of legislation. It's really almost impossible to think of big type of democratic programs that are going to get through this system. And the difference especially being in the House of Representatives, where yes, it's a small majority, but the House of Representatives is also for us a much more party-oriented body than the Senate, where there's party discipline. And Republicans aren't going to allow some votes where a few of their members defect and help Joe Biden. The idea that Joe Biden is going to win a lot of legislative victories against Republican wishes, I think, is not true. There may be some bipartisan things they do together on minor issues, but I think it is a big change in terms of that. Are we going into what we're saying of the future?
Yes,
we're
please.
Discussing. Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say too much because I liked a lot what was said. One point is midterm elections do not predict the next election, the presidential election. And we can see that in Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, who had terrible midterms and lost power and then came back and won very big victories 2 years later. The simplest point is the conditions are different in 2022, we think, or they may be, than they are in 2024. And I know we spent an election thinking maybe the fundamentals of, well, the economy isn't so good and the incumbent, it didn't work. I still think the fundamentals are very important. If I had a crystal ball, if some of the economists in the audience or in the first panel could tell me what the economy will look like in 2024, and it was a strong move, either much better or much worse, I could tell you what would happen in the election. It would be a very strong, good thing for Democrats if the economy improves. And if the economy gets worse, it will be a bad thing for the party in power. So I think that's uncertain what the overall outlook is. And we can sometimes say, well, it was good for Democrats and not as good for Republicans, but it doesn't really tell us anything about 2 years from now. There are a few structural factors which I think we should watch. The Senate for Republicans is the landscape is much more favorable in 2024 than it was in 2022. There aren't so many of these seats, but there are some seats in very Republican places that Democrats hold. The most famous, if you follow American politics, is Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat in West Virginia, which voted more than 40 percentage points for Donald Trump. That's a very tough seat to hold in Montana and Ohio, but other places where, especially if there's a little bit of a good Republican year, one could imagine good changes in the Senate. Again, it depends on the conditions, but the landscape is good. The House is very close. We could imagine that being up for grabs again, although I think we will see some redistrictings in a couple of states that will benefit Republicans, maybe in Ohio and North Carolina. Those will be small changes, but again, I think there are possibly some advantages there. I think when people talk about the future, they're mostly thinking about the presidential race. And we've mentioned him a little bit, but the big elephant in the room to joke is, of course, Donald Trump. But I think there's some questions of Joe Biden as well. And just none of us know exactly what is in the candidates' heads, but Joe Biden, I'm asked the question all the time, will he run for re-election? He will be 82 years old, or just after the election, he'll be 82 years old. He had a very quiet 80th birthday. They didn't make a big deal out of it in Washington, and I don't know why. I believe he will run. I think there's a strong reason to think that he is in a stronger position than he was 6 months ago, certainly. If you went back to May, again, which I think was the sort of low point for Democrats, things seemed much worse. There was talk, well, maybe Joe Biden won't run, or maybe somebody will challenge him, which does happen occasionally in our politics, not usually successfully, but a challenge usually means a certain sort of weakness. Jimmy Carter challenged by Ted Kennedy, and George H.W. Bush by Pat Buchanan, and examples of that. That talk has all kind of gone away. And so the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who was maybe thinking about it a little bit, said, no, I'm going to support Joe Biden if he runs. I think he feels good about this election result. And so he's much more likely to run as a candidate. But, we'll see what he decides. He thinks it may decide maybe as early as the beginning of next year. The question of Donald Trump, he's already announced, somewhat unofficially, but he's said he was going to run. I take him at his word. I think Donald Trump is in a weaker position, not only because of this election, but even the lead up to the election than he was. He is still a strong figure in the Republican Party, and it will be an interesting dynamic where the door has been opened now for other people to run against him. What will that look like, and what will be the outcome, I think is a real question. And the obvious person, the one who gets the most attention, and I think has a high level of name recognition and has done well among Republican voters, is Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. I still think that compared to Donald Trump, Joe Biden, or even Hillary Clinton, someone like Ron DeSantis is not known nationally in the same way. He still probably has a 20, 30% of the voters out there who probably don't know much about him. He will have to get known. But I think there's a way in which he has become the most obvious person who could challenge Donald Trump. There are others. There are plenty. There's some I dismiss. They're more sort of his critics and anti-Trump people, more moderate Republicans. But there are some who would run as kind of a more conservative, somewhat populist candidate, the governor of Virginia, others. But I think those other candidates will have a bit of a hard time in the next year in terms of the raising of money. What I think you're going to see is Donald Trump has raised money, probably continue to raise small amounts of money. Ron DeSantis has gotten a number of larger Republican donors saying, we didn't win as much with Trump and we need to shift, and we don't want to spread our money around all these other candidates. We're likely to put it in that basket. I mean, I think the real question for this has always been, can someone beat Trump? I think DeSantis might be able to, but it will still be a messy race. Donald Trump still has the support of the white working class, the white non-college educated voter within the Republican Party. That's a pretty strong vote. DeSantis could challenge that a bit, but more he's probably going to get the other vote. And then there's the question of, would Donald Trump perhaps run as a third party candidate? And that, I think, would be the death of Republican chances of winning if Donald Trump somehow goes through a very bloody race in the primary, ends up losing and says, I'll run as a third party candidate. I don't see how Republicans could win if they have that sort of division. And that might remind of the 1912 election of it, or some rare cases we've had. And I don't know that will happen, but I think it is something that anybody who wants to beat Donald Trump from the Republican side would have to negotiate all of those difficulties to be there. That being said, I think Ron DeSantis would arguably be a strong candidate, the governor of the third largest state, Republican state, and very strong performance in Florida himself, the party. We noted with Hispanic voters. I know you mentioned the advertising, but of course there was a lot of Democratic advertising in other states that pushed their positions too. Republicans won, both the senator and Rubio and governor, won in Miami-Dade County, where I just was a couple of weeks ago, a little warmer than here, where they, a very Cuban American community, which had voted Republican in the past, but that is a very Democratic county, and one that has moved and now moved again. And so I think Ron DeSantis has a lot of strength to do well, but he's got to negotiate these shoals of beating a Donald Trump and keeping him from undermining a possibility of Republicans winning. That's something that they're all going to have to watch out for, and which we'll be watching in the year of 2024 as the primaries begin.
Thank you very much, John. Danielle, I will have a straight one. Does the new Democratic primary calendar mean that Biden 24 is a done deal?
Okay, great. Thanks for that question. And I'll answer that question. And should I also speak about the other issues going forward?
Of course.
So as you mentioned, so the Democratic primary calendar has been changed. So that means that first we will have our primaries in South Carolina now instead of Iowa. This is a major change. Then in Nevada and New Hampshire, and then in Georgia and Michigan. So however, the first answer to that question is whether or not we're going to have a primary, because in the Democratic Party, because this assumes that there would be multiple candidates. If Joe Biden does announce his candidacy, which he's expected to do early next year, then it's probable that we will not have a real primary. So this is all kind of a moot question, and it's been this new primary calendar has been floated at a time, or suggested or adopted at a time when it's likely that we may not have one. So in fact, so that's I think your question is oriented towards the fact of suggesting this primary calendar would maybe establish his intentions to run more concretely.
I just wanted to remind that 2 years ago, he was crowned as the candidate in South Carolina. So it would give him a big advantage if a real primary would be organized.
Yes, precisely. But if Joe Biden does announce his candidacy, he will not be primaried. Most likely, he will. We don't expect that we'll have a primary. We won't see somebody like coming from the progressive wing. This is something I think that is important. I think to understand is that Joe Biden has been governing on a level that is really somewhat left of center. He's very, very popular among progressives. There are many aspects of his administration that really do appeal to and attract the progressive wings. Now, of course, there's always the different, tensions within every party. We have different groups, et cetera. I don't want to minimize that, but I would like to say that we have not seen a Democrat. We really do have a Democratic Party that is very unified. And we're very glad to see that his measures in many ways, for example, even we have a very labor-friendly Department of Labor now. We have a very labor-friendly National Relations, Labor Relations Board. Many things are happening on antitrust that are very attractive to even the progressive wing of the party. So all this to say, I doubt that we would see either Bernie Sanders or somebody, to take the place of Bernie Sanders to do a primary or of other sorts. Of course, the vice president's not going to primary the president, so we're not going to see that kind of thing happening. Now, of course, if Joe Biden does not announce if he decides not to run for president again, then we will see a primary, of course, and then we would follow the new schedule that I just laid out. Okay, to come back to just very briefly on a couple of questions, you mentioned whether or not the parties are calcified and there's a rigidity. I would agree with what John said. I think that, to some extent, there is some kind of rigidity, of course, in our system, necessarily after many, 200 years. However, I believe that we see the possibility for people who are relatively unknown, such as a Barack Obama and such as a Bill Clinton, to rise up to the highest level of power relatively quickly and very successfully, to go into 2 terms of office. And so I think that that's, there is really a kind of flexibility that's an exciting element of our political system, where people can actually, make change. Very talented people can find their places and find their voice. Now, the question of legislating and going forward with our new legislative possibilities, obviously we are going to be stymied by the Democratic Party will have difficulties given the fact that we don't have the House. However, I do believe that there are some real bipartisan things possible. There are many things that Republicans and Democrats can agree upon and that we will try to work towards. We will hope, from the point of view of the Democratic Party, we will hope that we will find enough Republicans willing to cross the aisle to work with us on very important things. One of the most important things, an immediate priority, will be approving the budget and extending the debt ceiling. So we will not allow the debt ceiling to be, or the economy of the United States and even the world to be held hostage by a few Republicans who manipulate this and use it as a tool in order to try to get a few, tax cuts or something like that. That would be really, really destructive. So we're hoping that there are some Republicans willing to do that. And we have hope for good reasons, because, for example, of the 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump in the House, 2 are left. 2 is important when you have a majority, when the margin is really just about 4. Okay, so those 2 Republicans working with the Democrats on this is a possibility. And then also, as you might remember, Kevin McCarthy's, we don't know who's going to be the Speaker of the House, because there are 31 Republicans who voted against him in the first round of voting for Speaker in the Freedom Caucus, and the more right wing of the Republicans. And so whether or not they're actually going to have party discipline, which you mentioned, I have some doubts. I think we're not seeing that party discipline in the House right now. We're going to see how that's going to play out. It will be very interesting to see whether or not they are able to, have a very cohesive group in the House at all, and whether or not there's even talk about the necessity of working together with the Democrats in order to elect the Speaker of the House. So that would be an interesting situation. So we'll see how that.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Célia, back to you. When it comes to platforms and programs, What could be the impact of those unusual midterms, according to you?
Thanks, Gilles. I'm going to try and summarize the state of play for both parties, because very much the platform and program of the Democratic Party is the one of the administration. So whatever Joe Biden will want to do in the next 2 years and will be able to do in the next 2 years. I do feel that the way the CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act were passed this year are demonstrative of a sort of a willingness to try and work across the aisle to more or less success, a sort of a technique that Joe Biden will, of course, continue to put in place. And of course, the loss of Nancy Pelosi as a Speaker of the House will be a massive one for being able to pass legislation, but I do not feel it's entirely impossible at this stage. So the priorities of the administrations are likely to be, of course, on continuation of the supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. It's going to be on immigration reform. It's going to be on, there's a lot of things that the administration can do with an executive order in terms of actually spending the money that has been voted in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, and so other climate priorities, etc. But fundamentally and politically, there will be a conversation within the Democratic camp, even if they all rally behind Joe Biden, because he has been strengthened by those results, clearly. And I do agree that he might not be challenged if he decides to run, for the simple reason that there's a feeling of relief, I think, among Democrats that he would be running again, a relief that potentially Kamala Harris doesn't have to impose herself as a clear heir to Joe Biden, because she's considered potentially unprepared or not up to the task because of a lack of popularity amongst her own party. But you still have an internal conversation within Democrats of what is the long-term path for the Democrats. And there's sort of different ways for prominence for the Democrats. You have sort of the old liberal that has long been the motivating factor in the Democrats that have been weakened after the losses in New York, for example. New York State was long considered, a stronghold for the Democrats and should never have been in play, but has demonstrated that without enough, young people energy, without enough progressive ideas, potentially this state has suffered some losses it shouldn't have. At the same time, you have a sort of a Midwest path. In Michigan, in particular, the Democrats have encountered a lot of success. And Gretchen Whitmer, governor of Michigan, just reelected, is out of this views, and it's a sort of no-nonsense progressivism, or a sort of a progressive, yes, but with some limits, or at least with some pragmatic outputs. And then you have sort of a Southern way that has long been theorized by people like Beto O'Rourke in Texas or Stacey Abrams in Georgia that have failed, both of them, to become respectively governor of Texas and governor of Georgia. And at the same time, just yesterday or 2 days ago, 3 days ago, Raphael Warnock was re-elected senator of Georgia along the same logic that those two were trying to implement, which is also mobilization of young people, people of color across the state, but also reaching out with Raphael Warnock had very much a sort of a bipartisan or pragmatist message to tell his voters, saying that he reached across the aisle, he worked with Ted Cruz, he did, he was the opposite of his opponent, which was an ultra MAGA type of candidate, really doing the Trumpist stump speech, and Raphael Warnock put himself in the shoes of being, again, no nonsense. So I think you have these different ways of approaching politics that apply to different regions that are going to be discussed in the next 2 years. And on the Republican side, it's likely to be highly tense. You will not see a sort of post-mortem really strategy because they don't have time. They have to try and gain some wins, but the majority is so small in the House of Representatives that for the new speaker, potentially Kevin McCarthy, it's going to be very hard to whip seats enough to make sure that you really gain points, and you will have internal infighting, including on the sort of the far right angle between the one side of the Freedom Caucus, who are a bit of the hair of Donald Trump, and the new sort of emerging Florida way, or those supporters of Ron DeSantis type of politics, which is very much Trumpism with a human touch or something like that, where Trumpism without the election deniers, Trumpism without the most outrageous positions that only Donald Trump can fight on, and all other candidates trying to do Trumpism fail at doing because they are not Donald Trump. And so I think this internal infighting is likely to occupy Republicans very much. But in the end, I do agree with John on this. Donald Trump still is a very strong candidate. He's weakened, yes, but the way the system is set up, he still raised a lot of money. Ron DeSantis is coming out quite early in terms of a big name. So, in 2 years, a lot can happen in between. Donald Trump has the money, an early start, extreme name recognition, and just by a function of primary effect, especially if he's challenged by quite a few candidates, he still has a very strong potentiality to be again the nominee for 2024.
Thank you, Célia. Any comment?
I had one small comment. I think it's not so important. You're right in terms of.
And I've got a question for you.
Okay, the primary calendar issue. Just one technicality. Democrats have changed their primary calendar, but they're not the only deciders, right? Many of these things actually have to be passed through state legislatures, and it's a little complicated because Republicans may not want to go in that same schedule in some of the legislatures. And I will point to the state of New Hampshire, where essentially the law says they must be first, and the Secretary of State is supposed to fight for that. So we'll have to see. But at the end of the day, I think Joe Biden's not going to be challenged, so these will be kind of empty primaries anyway. And so it hasn't all been finalized in that way. But yes, you had a question.
Yes, coming back to two governors, Glenn Youngkin and Ron DeSantis. Do they represent two different Republican identity?
So Glenn Youngkin is my governor. I live in the state of Virginia, and he won a big election in the off year. They have an odd year election in 2021. And he seemed at the time was a forerunner of a good Republican year because Virginia has moved over time to become a Democratic leaning state and won in that state. I would say if you say Ron DeSantis is Trumpism with a nicer face, Glenn Youngkin is sort of Trumpism with an even nicer face than that, maybe a little more moderate in some ways. I think Glenn Youngkin is a very interesting figure. He's very popular in Virginia. You saw, just like in Florida, his lieutenant governor came out and said, "I'm not for Trump." He's using his other people in the state to help his case. What I think is difficult for him will be this, that the non-Trump people, and that's, I think, a broader group now. It's not just the original anti-Trumpers. It's definitely a significant part of the party and money that will want another candidate to challenge Donald Trump is not likely to spread its money around to all sorts of candidates. And so Ron DeSantis, he's raised a lot of money. He's from a bigger state. He's got a much higher profile. He's been around a longer time. He's probably caused a little more controversy and helped him on the Republican side. I think they see him as the better candidate. And so, yes, Glenn Youngkin will get enough funds. He'll probably run. But there is a possibility that we end up with two candidates emerging, Donald Trump and DeSantis, who in the next year, where what really matters is showing your support, raising money, They come in as the two big candidates. With the others, yes, they may run, but their path is less. And so I think that's an issue. One last thing I will say is I said, and I strongly believe that the conditions today are one thing, conditions in 2024 are another. And I agree on everything. I think we all agree on that Joe Biden is much stronger and he's not going to be challenged within the party. Joe Biden is still at 42% job approval rating. Joe Biden is still a president who, 45% of the people say they strongly disapprove of our presidents have been very polarizing. Republicans don't like him a lot. They really, really don't. That could change a bit, but we should say he's strong in a sense, but not today a super strong candidate in terms of a general election. So, I think it's helpful to put that in context, that he's strong within his party, but still a pretty unpopular figure in America.
Thank you very much, John. So time has come for your question. Again, please introduce yourself. And if it's a question, it's much better.
Okay. Hello, thank you very much for all this. I have real questions and short ones. The first one has to do with the Democratic losses in the state of New York. Are they the result of a moderate incumbent being voted out during the primary election by more radicals on the left? Has it got to do with gerrymandering or other reason? My second question has to do with the paradox of voter suppression and high turnout. Because when we look at all the laws that try to restrict voting in the states that are controlled by Republican legislature, we have to conclude that there's been a massive effort toward voter suppression. Now, when we look at states like Georgia, apparently the voters were willing to stand in line, even though they were not allowed to receive drinks or sandwiches, because this is now in the new law, and there was a high turnout. So if some of you have explanations, I would appreciate. And although you've given some parts of answer about working across the aisle, I'm wondering whether anything will be possible, both during the lame duck session and after January, in terms of raising the debt ceiling, for instance, or legalizing the dreamers, when we think that the potential new speaker is hostage of all the people that he's been promising things. And so I don't see how many Republicans would dare vote with the Democrats. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for these questions. So first of all, in what happened in the state of New York, no, I don't think it has to do with in the primaries, whether a moderate incumbent was voted out by a more progressive candidates. In general, well, for example, even with the very unfortunate loss of Patrick Sean Maloney from when he lost his district, he actually had changed districts. So he was less well known in the new one. That was after the redistricting. So because of redistricting, the lines were drawn slightly different. So he was actually just a slight bit different in where he decided to run in the new district, and people didn't know him as well. And in fact, it overlapped with the district of somebody who was more progressive, who in fact, so he took that one over instead of the one who had been progressive. So no, I don't believe that is what happened. It's actually more of an issue where with the redistricting, it was done in such a way that was less favorable to Democrats, basically. Now, about the voter suppression and high turnout, absolutely agree with what you're saying. It's, in fact, we have there is still voter suppression. There are many problems of voter suppression. That is the loss of numbers of voting places, centers where people can actually go to vote. There's not enough of them, so there are very long lines. The fact that they are sometimes moved around, and so people don't know where they should go to vote, which is a form of voter suppression. The fact that there are not very many ballot drop boxes where people can put in their ballots in advance, which are entirely safe, by the way. For example, in one part of Houston, Texas, there's like one drop box for 3 million people, which is really not enough for people have to drive for 2 hours to get to it for example. And that's just, this is not facilitating the vote. We need to have better systems where we actually facilitate the vote, make it easier to vote and not suppress the ability to vote. So rather, I would say that if we had less voter suppression, we would have had a higher turnout. In fact, Democrats did very well despite the voter suppression that was existing. If we had better system with that, I think that we would do even better. Thank you.
So on New York, I think there were several factors. I do think redistricting was a factor here because there was a later last-minute change that a much more favorable map came in. But both in the case of Florida, which also there was a new map, and New York, you had a combination of the map plus a really good Republican performance. And two things about that good performance. One is the issue of crime was especially important in New York. And we do see rising crime, and that was an issue that Republicans mentioned nationally. But in New York City and the suburbs, Long Island, it was something that really took hold. And there were some very high profile cases, including outside the Republican candidate's house, a shooting. The Republican candidate for governor who lost but did very well, came close to winning, somewhat close, but close for New York. Lee Zeldin you could say he's a New York Republican, but he's also a very strong Trump supporter. So it's a little bit of a confusing thing. Trump supporters are not all the same type. So I think the issue of crime really did motivate Republicans in a way in New York that was helpful to them with these better districts. On voter suppression, I agree on much of what you said, but I guess I would say this. First of all, usually Americans come to Europe and say, we have to apologize that we have all this low voter turnout. And in some ways, it's been fair to say that. And my mother is Danish. And when I go to Scandinavia, well, we don't compare to those levels and the places that have required voter participation. But we've done actually much, much better in terms of turnout in America over the past 20 years, and certainly over the past few years. Our four presidential elections before 2020 were our four highest elections in terms of national presidential turnout in our modern history. And the 2020 election was by far our highest turnout election in terms of the presidential election. Our 2018 midterm election was by far the highest turnout. This one fell a little short of 2018, but was our second highest. And so we've been doing very well. I do some work on how we run our voting systems. I don't want to say everything is overstated, but I think the importance of enthusiasm and in some ways the importance of our polarization and that our parties, the negative side that we don't like each other is actually a motivating factor and a much bigger factor than the particular types of systems we've set up. Those systems have become very polarized, especially with 2020. And you now see, I wrote a book about absentee voting back in 2006. It wasn't as controversial. Today, it's become more of a party split in terms of not only what you think of it, but also how people want to vote. And some Republicans think, well, maybe Republicans are making a mistake to send their voters more to voting on election day. But I think we're polarized in that regard. I don't think that there is much that is done in these laws you talk about. I think Georgia was a particular big exaggeration that it was any real obstacle to voting. The idea of giving water is really more the idea that no one is supposed to be within a certain part of the polling place giving you anything, giving you campaign literature, so it was sort of outside groups not able to give you any sort of benefit. That was very much a non-issue. So I don't think that there's a lot of voter suppression. I also don't think there's a lot of voter fraud. I think that these laws, we can argue about them, but the effect that they have on turnout, I think at this point with our improvements that we've made over many years is very, very marginal. And then you mentioned voter fraud. Could you give examples of any voter fraud in the last election or in 2020? Sure. As I said, I don't think it is a major factor, but we are a big country with many, many polling places. And sure, there are, I will say, look, there are very small cases of people voting in two places, which we find it's not a factor. It's not something that's going to affect any election. There are certainly issues related to the integrity of elections that Republicans believe in, and some of them I think are legitimate issues. Our voting rolls, as Democrats say, they're probably not as comprehensive as they might be, but they're also not as clean and organized as they might be. And Republicans, I think, are right to want to improve those. Issues like voter identification, those I think are neither huge problem nor some silver bullet that solves any great voter fraud issues. But, I think that on either side, we get excited about these big concepts of integrity and access, and it's important to have that debate. But I think what we're talking about now in terms of the types of systems we put in place are really marginal changes around the edges that are not preventing people in big ways from voting. We still have, just if you don't have drop boxes, there are all sorts of ways to get your ballot in. There are all sorts of ways to vote, and they do differ from state to state, but there's no great place that is restrictive in a way that was the case, certainly 30, 40 years ago, and even slightly less than that. And then you asked one other question about the working across the aisle and what might be done in the lame duck. I don't think we're going to raise the debt ceiling in the lame duck. And maybe I would just put this in a context of what can be done in the next 2 years, what has to be done across the aisle. The one place where Republicans are going to have to be part of the legislative process is in the budget appropriations process and raising the debt ceiling. And that can be a difficult position for them to be in some ways. They're going to have to provide some votes probably to raise the debt ceiling. They're going to try to extract concessions. That also will be tricky because they'll be seen as potentially holding up or to shut down the government. On the other hand, they have some leverage to get some things done. And so it'll be a negotiation. It will probably be very messy, and we'll probably shut down the government briefly, as we do often, and then we'll resolve it, and we'll probably be past the debt ceiling limit with a lot of anguish. But those are the places where actually votes of both sides are needed, because we do need to fund our government in some way, and we do need to raise the debt ceiling. And some of those side issues may come up, Ukraine funding, where there'll be a negotiation, and Republicans may extract some conditions or lessen things, but I think that'll be the negotiation. In the regular process of passing laws, I think there will be little done that is sort of the Democratic agenda peeling off a few Republicans. And what I meant by the House was, you could talk about party discipline, but also it's just that the leadership in the House gets to determine a lot, like whether you have a vote, and it's a very controlled party atmosphere. The Senate is very different. And so Kevin McCarthy, if he's there, and we could talk about that, I think he'll get there, but we don't know how, and it could be a little messier than we thought. Or whoever the speaker is will have the ability to really schedule things and put votes on the table. And so I think we'll see a few compromises where the parties want to compromise on some smaller things, but outside the appropriations process, we won't see that much. And we will see things like executive orders. And the typical pattern of presidents in a divided government is to use the power of appointment and personnel, to use the power of executive orders, and to spend more time in foreign policy where they do not require Congress's approval. I think we'll see more of that from Joe Biden.
Thank you very much. Next question, please. This gentleman, maybe on your left. On your left. Thank you.
Thank you. Axel Krauss. I'm the contributing editor of Transatlantic Magazine based in Washington. This is a question for John and Danielle. John, if you were advising Ron DeSantis running for president, what would you advise him to put forth as issues that could be winning for the Republicans? Foreign policy, domestic policy, and the economy, whatever. But what would you advise him to do to win? And Danielle, if you were advising Joe Biden on what he should do beyond running on his record in foreign policy in particular, what issues do you think are winning potentially for a Joe Biden run beyond running for his running on his record in his first term? Thank you.
We'll take a second question.
Well, it's not really a question, Laura Kenneton, University of Versailles. It's just a breaking news. Kristen Sinema just left the Democratic Party. Now deal with it. She's caucusing as an independent. She's not crossing the aisle as a Republican. So now it's a whole new ball game.
You get my reaction in real time. Wow. I'm not sure what to say about that. That's actually extraordinary, amazing news. So she's caucusing as an independent, and I don't know what this is going to mean exactly going forward. We do have now a majority of 51. That is now 50, apparently, if she's not with us. But we can, I think, assume that we can hope that she will continue to do things like vote for the nominations for judges that Biden nominates, and I think the confirmations of the judges. So I think that that's still secure. I would hope so anyway. I don't believe it would. Well, okay, Arizona 2024. I personally, I vote in Arizona, so I know Arizona well. She's never been out of campaign season in Arizona. All of these years, her name is coming up on TV. And I think it has also been in order to prepare some type of thing as what you've just announced to us. That is to have the name recognition in order to vote, to win against somebody who's going to primary her in the Democratic Party, which is planned, basically. There would be a primary against her. She's very unpopular in the Democratic Party for various reasons for the way she's voted. And so now I think this is, truth coming out. So thank you for that news.
John?
Yeah, so I know there's the first question. I mean, quickly on the cinema, I agree. I don't think there's any particular difference in the governing of the Senate. Democrats will still have the majority. The committee balance will be worked out in the Senate rules, which will be, the Senate tends to mimic much more the majority that the party has. The majority, the committees will be close. They'll probably be a one-seat Democratic majority essentially on each committee, and that won't change with Kristen. I think it is about the primary. She's going to be primaried, and she has a very difficult road to win, because she has to win that primary from a likely challenge from a House member who's more progressive, and a party, and a national party that has sometimes been unhappy with her. And winning as either winning that primary, which would be if she says she's an independent, will she run in the Democratic primary? Maybe she still will, but winning as an independent is tricky. And Joe Lieberman once lost in a primary, ran as an independent, and won. And you've seen, in a way, Lisa Murkowski in a certain way doing some things like that. But it's hard. It's hard to either win as an independent or to negotiate your primary. So I think it's really about trying to position herself, knowing she's in this kind of a little bit of a Netherland, and trying to embrace it in some ways and go forward. The earlier question was about what I would say to Ron DeSantis. I think, first of all, primaries, and we will have a primary on the Republican side, and probably one on the Democratic side, are not as much about the differences between the candidates as they are about there's a similar policy, and you are saying you are the person who is going to best represent the party, either best represent those views or more able to win with that set of views. So I don't think we're likely to see at least the winning candidates, the possible winning candidates, argue a lot about differences in policy. You will see maybe some very moderate Republicans who will get a lot of attention in Washington and the press, who are never going to win, have maybe some different views. But I think the challenge for Ron DeSantis is, in some ways, he wants to run as Trump with a nicer face, but then there's Trump sitting there. And so who are his natural supporters are going to be? If Ron DeSantis were by himself, he would get the Trump coalition. But if he's now running against Trump, he's going to take the college-educated voters and some of the others and some of the Trump coalition and try to win. And I think he's going to have to not look like a never Trumper. So he arguably might have to come out as a more full-throated populist in some ways to challenge Donald Trump. Yes, I think he will say he's more pragmatic and he wants to win, and he thinks he can win. And I think that's the biggest message. I will give you the type of program that Donald Trump had, but we've been losing, and this is I've shown success in this version of things in Florida. I mean, big issues of crime and immigration will be important. We saw them as important in this last election, but especially in New York and crime, I think they'll still be important for the Republican base. They'll still be important things to go forward. One thing Republicans have been running on, and it's of course it's controversial in Democratic circles, is some of the cultural and social issues, especially relating to schools. Glenn Youngkin also ran on these, whether it's questions of performance of the schools, or the schools are too woke, or there's sort of a woke PC culture out there. That's something that actually I think Republicans are worried about. When you ask people about were they interested in democracy, Democrats, of course, had lots of interest in democracy, and they meant one thing by it. But a lot of Republicans said, yeah, they're worried about democracy, and they meant other things, like that there was a woke or PC culture, or that the media and others and universities and elites are picking on them in various ways, or certain types of investigations they didn't like. I think Ron DeSantis will probably emphasize all of those things. But the challenge for him is to beat Trump while seeming like Trump, but being a much more electable candidate, and then keeping him from running against him as an independent. So I don't know how he does all that, but that's the challenge.
Danielle?
Your advices?
Yeah, thanks for that question about what Biden should do towards 2024. Now, of course, any president running for a second term is going to run on his what he's done. So we can't extract that from the thing. And in fact, what he would do is what I would advise him to do, where in that situation, would be to continue to go along the same lines of trying to strengthen his agenda, which is a strong one, that is of working towards enacting national legislation to protect women's reproductive rights, to actually have real gun control laws that really limit the proliferation of guns, so that we can see a tangible difference in that situation. Continue working towards climate action, and also to enact measures that really do protect our voting rights. And then continue to do the things that he has been doing. Now, we must understand that many of the things he has done, that the administration has done, will take time. They have only just recently been enacted, that, for example, the infrastructure law, the IRA. There's many things that will take time to come into play, and those will help people's lives, that will help people with creation of jobs on the economic level. I think that we will see some real benefits and some real fruit from the measures that have already been enacted over the next 2 years. And I think that you can say that he would run on wanting to continue that route in order to help people. Now, it's an interesting thing to say that, Democrats, when we are enacting these measures to help people basically to improve the economic situation, we have extremely low unemployment in the United States now. It's very easy to get a job. There are twice as many jobs as there are job seekers, and we have rising wages. Now, that is actually an excellent economic balance sheet so far. So people focus on the inflation, but that's because, I think the Republicans have oriented it very much along the issue of inflation, which is certainly a legitimate issue. Inflation is all around the world. However, a lot of people are going to be seeing a lot of benefits that will mitigate the effects of inflation. And in fact, inflation in gas prices is already going down. But for example, lowering the drug prices for seniors and for many people in Medicare, and other drug prices are now going to be capped and going to be negotiated. So we're going to have that will also be one way in which people will feel an effect that mitigates the inflation. So you're mentioning Ron DeSantis and whether or not, about the question of economic populism and situation like that. When we talk about economic populism, and with Trump, for example, who ran on an economic populist line, but he didn't do anything actually for the people. This is the term that's used for when we talk about Republicans is economic populism, but I actually compare that to what the Democrats are doing, is actually doing things that help working people. So it's not called populist, but it's actually helping.
Thank you, Danielle. Next question, please.
Yes, thank you. I also had a question about New York. Because so as we discussed, these unpredicted losses have generated a lot of debate within the Democratic Party. And you mentioned in particular the case of New York 17 with the defeat of Jean-Patrick Meloni, who is the chair of the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And there have been a lot of debates within the Democratic Party, and especially there have been calls also for the resignation of Jay Jacobs as chair of the New York State Senate Democratic Committee. And so I was wondering if all of these debates, especially with progressives, kind of foreshadow more deeper changes in terms of power dynamics within the Democratic Party and the Democratic Caucus.
Another question, please.
Thank you. I think it's great. I think this is probably the only place in France where we delve into US politics as much once a year. So anyway, I had a question. So we about the presidential candidates for 2024. So we discuss on each side, either Biden or somebody else for the Democratic Party, either Trump or somebody else for the Republican Party. And I want to discuss the question of age, because I believe there would be, my question is, wouldn't there be an influence of the candidate on one side on the choice of the candidate on the other side? In other words, if somebody very young is running on the Republican side, such as Ron DeSantis, whom I believe is only 46? Okay.
He will be 46.
He will be 46. Yeah. Well, that would be difficult for Biden to pull off. And the other way around, if there's a young person on the Democratic side who looks, as a probable candidate winning the Democratic primaries, that would look bad for Trump because he would appear as too old.
Thank you. Célia, you wanted to say something, and maybe go back to your advices for foreign affairs.
I think I'll pass on the New York 17 question and leave that to Danielle. Hopefully she has a better clue, even though I'll say one thing. There's an internal struggle again within the Democratic Party on whether or not to foster and work on one of the core elements of their coalition, which is college-educated white people, including white women, for which arguably they might have been, less mobilized over in the more progressive era where we focus on young people, diversity, workers union or other types, and what you see in sort of evolution of the electoral map is in the northeast part of the United States, you have a push towards the Republican Party for defending some of this more, what I was calling old liberal sort of communities that are also more wealthy. They are liberal and they might be mobilized on questions such as abortion, but if they feel confident that they live in New York and they don't risk losing their access to abortion right, arguably they might be interested in a classic Republican Party line on the economy or inflation or something like that, and that might have been at play in New York as well. On the 2024 age thing, yes, it will be striking if that happens, if one of the two happens, but I really have a hard time seeing it happen in the way the second way you describe, which is a young Democrat to fight the older Trump, just because of timing. You will have Biden has to announce and he will be full on. And so you won't have, if Trump goes, you won't have a switch on the Democratic side. So the other possibility that you raise, which is because Biden runs and would in that case be unchallenged, will the Republican be tempted by a young Ron DeSantis? Yes, he's 35 years younger than Donald Trump. So yes, it's tempting, but I would say it's less the question of the age than the question and what to recommend to Ron DeSantis. It's that he has the same platform, but you have to remember that Trump has a certain way, a certain pessimism, a certain way of relitigating the past, of whining not only about his own fate, but about the fate of America. Trump published a book in 2016 called Crippled America, in which he had this frowny face and he was really unhappy about the crippled America. Ron DeSantis has a sort of sunny optimism to it, a little bit angry. He's angry on immigration, he's angry against the woke left or whatever, but with some form, representing a form of, Florida optimism, faith in progress, in, tax cuts and other ways to be strong. And I would say that's his strength. If he's able to pull it off and defeat Trump, that's the way he would do do it. And in that case, yes, in front of a more aging Biden, he would be quite strong. But again, as John said, Biden has full name recognition, is an incumbent. And also, as John said, it's way too early to speculate on all of this.
John and Danielle, your last words.
So on the age thing, I guess I want to say, I think we have kind of just a set of coincidences in American politics that has caused us to have many, many old leaders. I don't think it's a trend. I think, obviously we will replace them at some point. We have a president who just turned 80 and Donald Trump who's 76. And Ronald Reagan was running for his second term and ended up at the time winning and becoming the oldest president elected at his time. And during the debates, Walter Mondale, he made a quip. He said, I'm going to forgive my opponent for the comments about age because I don't want to use his youth and experience against him. So that was a sort of very funny line. But you have to realize at that point, Ronald Reagan was 4 or 5 years younger than Donald Trump is today, 7 or 8 years younger than Joe Biden. So, it is extraordinary. We have this older group. We had 3 leaders in the House of Representatives on the Democratic side who were over 80. We've now replaced them with much younger people. We have, Mitch McConnell, who is a Republican leader in the Senate, who's almost 80 or just about 80, and Chuck Schumer's in his 70s. So it really is striking. I think it is just a weird set of coincidences. We'll eventually get back to, I don't know, electing people in their 50s and 60s more commonly. But I do think it could be somewhat of an issue. I think we're very polarized and the parties are going to line up around their candidates. But a difference between Ron DeSantis, if he were the nominee, and Joe Biden of 35 years, in more cases, we've seen a younger Democrat, an older Republican, and that sort of playing in their favor in various times in history. But I think it is somewhat of a slight advantage. I think politics can make much too much of that for Joe Biden. But he is by far the oldest president we've ever had. And if it's a big contrast like that, I think it's something that potentially could work in Republicans' favor.
Okay, great, thanks. So very quickly to answer your question, just very quickly, it's more complicated what happened in Maloney's district. I don't think that we can extrapolate from it. It's a convergence of factors that's unique to this situation with the redistricting, and then also he took over another person's in that. So it's he wasn't well known. So no, I think that the debate on what's going to happen within the Democratic Party is quite deep, and we can talk about that maybe at another time. But as a last word about the age question, which is a legitimate question, certainly, I think it's necessary to remember that a president is not just an individual. A president is one who also has a whole team around him or her, and that they are choosing and governing with a very strong team, okay? And the team that Biden has chosen is very, very competent, very strong. And they need continuity. And they need time, because it takes time to do things, to actually make things come into practice. And I think that the fact that Democratic Party, both on the progressive side and on the centrist side, rallies around the agenda of the Biden administration is very important. And I think that will have priority over the age question. I think that we often associate with the younger candidates with a younger electorate. Well, the younger electorate is turning out for Biden and his candidates. And so I don't think actually that's going to be a real problem. Of course, it would be ideal if he were younger, but the fact is he does have this experience. He's created a team that's very powerful, and certainly continuity is extremely important in politics. So it would be the best candidate.
Thank you very much. I think this discussion was very, very interesting, very fruitful. So please join me in thanking your very, very smart speaker. Thank you.